Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bernanke, I have one comment and two questions. My comment is thank you for your incredible service in very turbulent times. You've been very steady, and I think all of us really appreciate that. Two questions, one about Mr. Lewis and Bank of America, and then one following up on what Mr. Fortenberry was asking about. Mr. Lewis was here, and he had a number of different stories on a single transaction. He told the shareholders that this Merrill deal was a great deal for them, and persisted in that story even in December after he found out about a $9 billion additional deterioration. And to frankly, my amazement and shock, he never bothered to tell the shareholders the news that led him to the next assertion he made, that that was so dire that he might invoke the nuclear option of the MAC clause. And then he told us, basically, that using his words, he didn't use the word threat, but he said there was heavy pressure from the Fed and Treasury to go through with this deal, with the assurance that the American taxpayer, through the Fed and the Treasury, would back up any of the toxic assets from Merrill. And I'll just ask one specific question about that. One of his assertions to the board was that the Treasury and Fed have confirmed they will provide assistance to the corporation to restore capital and protect the corporation against the adverse impact of the Merrill Lynch assets. And he went on to say the corporation can rely on the Fed and Treasury to complete and deliver the promised support by January 20, the date scheduled for the release of earnings by the corporation. In your recollection, is that an accurate statement by Mr. Lewis?
We did indicate that we would work with him in good faith to develop a transaction, develop a package that would preserve the stability of his company, and we proposed to do that by January 20th.
And that included backing up the toxic assets on Merrill's balance sheet?
There were no specifics about how we were going to do it. There were different possible approaches in the event that ring fence is apparently not even going to be consummated.
All right, but what he was specifically referring to was the news that they were aware of, that Merrill had far more in toxic assets than had been disclosed to shareholders when they approved the deal in the early part of December. So is it your recollection that the assurance he gave his board that the Fed and Treasury would back up the toxic assets on Merrill was accurate?
Well, he knew that in the case of Citi, for example, that we had used both capital and a ring fence. So clearly that was one of the options that we were discussing as part of the transaction.
Okay, I want to get to this question that was started by Mr. Fortenberry. You've wisely stated, in my view, that we do need a new regulatory regime to protect the economy from systemic risk. And there's really two approaches that can be taken, and the Congress has to make a judgment which is the better one to go. One is a supersized regulator or some entity that has the capacity to monitor the risk of these huge financial conglomerates that when they go down bring us all with them. That's one approach. The other approach is to take the view that if an institution is too big to fail, it's too big to exist. And the virtue of that, frankly, is that it brings them down to a size where we don't have to depend on the vigilance of regulators being overcome by the influence of the financial industry. So my question to you is, does it make sense for Congress to pursue a policy that says if an institution is too big to fail without threat to the economy, it is in fact too big to exist, and instead of regulating it, we should break it up?
Well, there are two options. One is to allow large banks, but to take steps that will protect the economy if in fact one comes to the brink of failure, which is what the Treasury's proposal, for example, includes. The other possibility is to restrict the size of banks. I think it's legitimate to discuss both options. I would just point out that very large banks do have an economic function, a global reach, diversity of activities, but Congress may wish to look at different options. I don't want to prejudge what you will be deliberating.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. When our colleagues on the Republican side have others who show up, they'll be recognized in a turn. We recognize Mr. Cantor.